Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York. Welcome to One to One. Each week, we address issues of timely and timeless concern with newsmakers and the journalists who report on them. Artists, writers, scientists, educators, social scientists, social activists, government leaders. We speak with each one-to-one. I'm pleased to welcome Andrea Miller to the program. She wears a double mantle of president of NARAL Pro Choice New York and president of the National Institute for Reproductive Health. During this presidential election cycle, all the rhetoric about who is more pro-choice or pro-life may be causing those who have the greatest need for accurate information and help with their reproductive decisions to get lost in the noise. Good morning.
Good morning,
I think
Sheryl.
I call you Andrea, but it's Andrea, right?
It is Andrea,
okay.
but thank you.
All right. Just to start off, how does the work of NARAL Pro Choice New York differ from that? You're also the head of the National Institute for Reproductive Health. So how are they different, and how are you both different from Planned Parenthood?
Well, in many ways, I would say the best way to answer the question about NARAL Pro Choice New York and the National Institute for Reproductive Health is to think about them as being sort of two sides to an equally important whole. NARAL Pro Choice New York is really the political arm of our work. It is the work in the elections, which clearly is going to be ramping up already. We have a truncated season here in New York, unlike probably what we've ever seen before. We're still waiting to see what happens with redistricting and when the election primary cycle is actually going to be set. But we know it's going to be earlier than September, so that means that work is going to be all the more critical this year. We have a pro-choice assembly, but not a fully pro-choice, not a majority pro-choice Senate here in New York. So that means that work is essential. The NARAL Pro Choice New York is also the arm that does the lobbying in Albany as well as here in New York City. Since New York City, of course, as we were talking earlier, the city itself encompasses more people than many of the states that I lived in as a child. And so the city is equally critical in making sure that reproductive health care and reproductive health services are protected. The other arm, the other sort of companion to that is the National Institute for Reproductive Health. That's really an innovation institute. It does policy analysis, strategic thinking, message development, and tactical assistance, both to the work that we do that can be the research, for instance, that is the backup to understanding what policies are needed, to understanding where the gaps are, to think about how can we move forward in New York, both at the city level and at the state level, and simultaneously being an innovation institute that says we understand that being in New York gives us both an opportunity to make the best of things, to make the best example of a city and a state that protect and respect women's reproductive health and rights. But at the same time, we have a true obligation to those in other cities and in other states who are desperate for support, ideas, and collaboration that can help them move forward or at least help them stem the tide. So it's really that combination that I think is so powerful and was one of the reasons that I was so excited to accept the presidency in those two organizations.
In recent years, we've seen a lot less in the press about abortion clinics being bombed, abortion doctors being murdered, about people from Operation Rescue harassing women who are going into abortion clinics by toting the coffins with the fetuses in them. Has the assault on the abortion rights lessened, or has it simply taken different forms?
I would say that it is both and neither. It is not lessened if you look at the fact that there was, just in the last couple of weeks, another clinic firebombed and burned to the ground.
Where was that? That
was actually in Florida. It's the very same clinic where the first abortion provider, Dr. David Gunn, was killed in 1994. Yes, down in Pensacola. So it may not be making headlines nearly to the degree that it has in the past, but every person who provides reproductive health care in this country knows that they do so at their own peril and at their family's peril. And that is truly a disgrace. That is truly a disgrace. It is domestic terrorism. We should be treating it as such. And I think, thankfully, the nation is now more treating it as such. Thankfully, the Obama administration takes that very seriously and is looking at those threats very carefully and is providing, for example, the kind of support to healthcare providers when they're feeling under siege. Let's remember that we did have a doctor murdered a year ago.
Now, there does seem to be a growing assault on abortion rights by state legislatures.
Yes, that is absolutely correct.
The Ohio House joined at least 6 other states last year in voting to ban abortions after the 20th week of pregnancy. New Hampshire cut off funding for Planned Parenthood. Wisconsin adopted a number of regulations that onerous on clinics that perform abortions. Some states now require that before a woman can get an abortion, she must be shown a sonogram of her unborn child. And so are there states where Roe v. Wade has, for all practical purposes, been overturned?
I mean, I would argue yes. I would argue that you have to ask the question, is Roe versus Wade meaningful or meaningless for the individual woman in a particular circumstance, in a particular state? And unfortunately, the litany of restrictions that you have mentioned, coupled with the declining access to providers in some really critical regions of this country and the increasing geographic concentration of providers, that combination has really meant that for many women it is a right that is becoming hollow.
So what are some states or some regions where Roe v. Wade has been seriously undermined?
Well, let's take an example of South Dakota, and I think South Dakota is a really interesting case. On the one hand, South Dakota has had multiple attempts on their ballot with ballot initiatives to essentially ban all abortions outright. In the personhood notion that was the last iteration, other iterations, but it's a virtual ban on almost all abortions, if not all abortions.
That law was actually
They were
passed?
defeated at the ballot by the citizens of South Dakota, and I give them tremendous, tremendous appreciation and applause for recognizing that that was so extreme that it could not be allowed to stand, and was in fact designed to challenge Roe versus Wade all the way up to the Supreme Court. So on the one hand, you see that happening in the populace, you see people recognizing that's going way too far and pushing back. On the other hand, that is a state with one provider of reproductive health care services that includes abortion care. It's a very big state. Have you ever driven across South Dakota? It basically takes you 2 days. It's a very big state. There's one provider, and most of the time they have to fly doctors in because there aren't doctors there who can provide these services. So that means that for women in that state, it's an extraordinary burden. Add to that a legislation that requires them now to wait an unprecedented 72 hours after receiving biased state-scripted information, but to see that they think about their decision. And to add insult to injury, they are forced to go to a crisis pregnancy center, an anti-choice facility whose whole mission is
to talk them out of it.
Not only talk them out of it, but use manipulation, deception, outright lies to convince them that this is not the right choice for them. Now, I'm not saying that women shouldn't get full counseling and be able to consider their options. But let's face it, women think very long and hard about what to do when they face an unintended pregnancy or when something goes wrong with their pregnancy. And it is not the government's or politicians' business to be saying, we're now going to force you to wait, especially in a state where they're already traveling hundreds and hundreds of miles to get care. And they're obviously thinking about this quite seriously.
Now, New York has always been considered a sort of a progressive model in terms of reproductive and abortion rights. Are there threats to those rights in this state?
Absolutely. I mean, yes, New York is in a far better state and a far better position than many states, and women here have greater access to many of the services that they need to protect and promote their reproductive health and make those choices about their childbearing and parenthood. However, let's be clear, it's not like we can go home. I mean, I would love to be out of a job, frankly, in New York. I would love to be able to say that our work is done here and all is good, but it is not. Take, for instance, the fact that our laws currently, and there's a bill pending in the legislature this year called the Reproductive Health Act to try to address this. One of the core fundamental problems with our laws is they date back so long ago that they treat the issue in an outmoded way. So, for instance, here in New York, a woman who is carrying a pregnancy that she very much wants, but discovers late that something's gone tragically wrong. If she is after the 24th week of pregnancy, and even her health is at risk, she cannot, under our law, terminate that pregnancy here in New York. She has to leave the state. That is obviously...
Is that new legislation?
No, actually, well, the new legislation would reverse that.
Okay.
The Reproductive Health Act would repeal that provision.
So that's been the case for a long
But
time?
that has been the case since basically the early 70s.
So where would she have to go? Where could she go?
Well, you know, that's a very good question, especially because one of the places she used to go was to Kansas, but Dr. Tiller was murdered.
Okay.
So you have to understand that that New York is not by any means out of the woods, as they say. And let's also remember that we have, for instance, those crisis pregnancy centers that I mentioned in South Dakota. Well, there are more than 100 of them across the state. So we have a lot of work to do. Thankfully, New York City passed an ordinance to try to basically give consumers protection to make those facilities
There are more than 100 of them
acknowledge.
across New York State.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And that, unfortunately, that ordinance has been caught up in the courts. But we're hopeful that that will proceed, and that then we can use that as a model to protect women in other cities and other parts of the state from being lied to, misled, and denied timely access to care.
Has the number of abortions in this country been going up or down?
It's actually been trending somewhat downward, not in a sizable way, but it has been trending somewhat downward.
Now, you had at NARAL Pro Choice in Massachusetts before
Yes.
coming here.
Yes.
How does Massachusetts compare with New York in terms of?
There's some interesting similarities and interesting differences. The similarities are they're both states that, for the most part, have largely gone in the right direction, I would argue, improving access to care, improving and expanding the rights and the opportunities around reproductive health, so ensuring that contraception is covered in health plans, ensuring that family planning is provided, providing coverage for abortion care in the context of publicly funded insurance programs, so women who are lower income, if they make the decision whether to have a child or if they need to terminate that pregnancy, the government's not telling them one choice you can do and the other you cannot, simply because you rely on publicly subsidized health insurance for your care. So there are a lot of ways in which they're very similar. They're also have both extraordinary medical communities and medical communities, many of whom have a tremendous commitment to promoting reproductive health and really being on the cutting edge of that. Their differences are in the very sort of insidious ways that our opposition has moved their ball forward. And it's really about, again, what's happening in terms of the disparities in access to care and the disparities in health outcomes. I would say New York City is unique in that we have probably some even greater disparities than I saw even in the entire state of Massachusetts, because this is complex. It's not simply a matter of access to care, it's also a whole host of socioeconomic factors that influence whether someone is able to prevent pregnancy, an unintended pregnancy in the first place, or all the way down to being able to have a healthy child. And even in the city of New York, there are extraordinary disparities that I would guess, and I could be wrong on this, and I would turn to my colleagues at some place like the Guttmacher Institute to correct me if I am, that Massachusetts may not have quite the wide range of disparities that we see here in even New York City.
We're going to take a short break. Then we'll be back with more with Andrea Miller, president of NARAL Pro Choice New York and the National Institute for Reproductive Health, after this message.
John can hold his daughter. Marilyn can laugh with her sons. Raphael can play with his sister. Gregory can fly. None of this would have been possible without an organ donor. Keep life going. Sign up to be an organ donor today. You can register when you renew your driver's license or online at savelivesnewyork.org. The more New Yorkers who sign up, the more lives saved. One of them could be someone you love.
Welcome back to One to One. I'm Sheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York, and I'm talking with Andrea Miller, president of NARAL Pro Choice New York and the National Institute for Reproductive Health. Reproductive rights are also under attack at the national level. A few years back, Congress enacted a ban on late-term abortions. Is that law actually in effect, or is it still being tested in the courts?
It actually is. It was a ban allegedly aimed at a particular procedure used later in pregnancy. In fact, it's more expansive, and that, of course, is of concern. If you ask any doctor who's practicing medicine and reproductive health care or who's in OB-GYN currently, they have to think about the fact that there is a federal criminal statute. It makes it a federal crime, a felony crime, if they were to run afoul of that law. Now, the particular concern that I have, and I think many of us have, is that it really creates a chilling effect. Because it does not indicate at what point in pregnancy it would apply. So there is sort of this overlay.
It just addresses a particular procedure?
Allegedly a particular procedure. But as you know, medicine is not a perfect science. Medicine, things happen during surgery where doctors have to make judgment calls during a procedure, whether it's heart surgery or terminating a pregnancy. You want your physician to be thinking first and foremost, I need to protect my patient's health. That is the most important thing here, and I need to make judgment calls based on that. Unfortunately, what this law does, what the federal law does, is it sort of turns that notion on its head, and it places physicians in a position, because there is no exception to protect a woman's health, it puts them in potentially the unconscionable position of having to sit there and think, okay, what do I do to protect my patient's health? What does the law tell me I have to do? And which one do I choose? So that is of deep concern. It was upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court in 2007. And there was a deeply, deeply troubling decision because it was the first time since Roe versus Wade that the Supreme Court acted in absolute contravention of its long-standing principle, and that is that no matter what, we are fine. If you need to ban abortion after the point of viability, the Supreme Court has said since Roe versus Wade, you can do that. But you must continue to ensure that a woman's life and her health is protected. And what that ban did is it removed that health protection for whatever those procedures are that the Congress deemed to now be banned. And that is a terribly dangerous precedent, and hopefully one that the court, if they ever see another measure come to it, whether it's from the Congress or from the states, and as you know, so many of these things are sweeping across the states, as we were discussing earlier, and Congress is poised, unfortunately. I mean, we're protecting family planning dollars, but barely. I mean, this is an incredibly radical, incredibly extreme Congress.
How do you rate President Obama on abortion rights?
Well, look, last Friday, I have to say, was a tremendous day because the President, the Department of Health and Human Services confirmed that, for instance, contraception under the Affordable Care Act, the federal health reform law, will be considered, as it well should be, and as any woman would agree, should be considered preventive care that will no longer require a copay if it's covered by your insurance. Now, it's going to take some time for that to roll out, but that's a really extraordinary victory. And many aspects of the Affordable Care Act do really improve women's access to reproductive health care. Obviously, it's incredibly disappointing that the anti-choice forces in Congress forced a Hobson's choice. They basically said, we are going to do everything possible to use health reform as a tool to attack access to abortion care. And they created an untenable position. And I salute the President for trying valiantly to move that forward without restrictions that would be so devastating. We are grappling now with restrictions in the Affordable Care Act, and that has opened the floodgates at a number of states as well.
On the other hand, Barack Obama did not oppose the partial birth abortion ban, correct? I don't know if he was a senator at the time or...
You know, I have to look back at the history. My memory is that there was a funny thing about the timing on this. Look, let's face it, that's a hard issue. I'm not going to pretend it's not. It's a hard issue partly because our opposition, you know, picked up that old adage that Harry Truman used to say. If you can't convince them, confuse them. And that's exactly what they did with that law. And they confused the public, they confused policymakers, they kept moving the goalposts. First they said we're talking about abortions very, very late in pregnancy. Then they said we're talking about one specific procedure. Then they said, and they kept moving the ball around, and no one could follow it. The reality is that it was incredibly difficult for many policymakers to understand. But at the end of the day, I would guarantee you that the President is clear that the fact that there is no exception to protect a woman's health in that federal law is a serious problem for him, as it is for many pro-choice legislators.
At the same time, his Secretary of Human Health Services,
Health and Human Services, yes,
overruled the FDA's recommendation that Plan B be sold to girls under the age of 17, which, you know, and the FDA had found that there were no health problems, no risks associated with it. Sounded like a strictly political decision to me.
It felt like a strictly political decision, and it was deeply, deeply upsetting, deeply disturbing. If you look at our website, you'll see that I put out a very strong statement, as did many of my colleagues. The reality is it harkens back to a time that I thought this president had set behind us, a time in the Bush administration where politics trumped science, and I think that's exactly what happened here. And let me be clear, it isn't simply a matter of whether young women under the age of 17 can have access to backup birth control and a second chance to prevent an unintended pregnancy. What the FDA's bizarre dual status for Plan B means is that every single woman, regardless of her age, who needs a backup birth control method when time is of the essence, has to get it from the pharmacist, dependent upon, even though it's technically an over-the-counter drug, it has to sit behind the pharmacy counter. And that means you have to stand in those pharmacy lines. You have to ask for it. You have to have the time to wait for the pharmacist. You have to have the ability to get to a pharmacy You have to know that the pharmacy hours are going to work for you. New York City, we have a lot of 24-hour pharmacies. That is not true in much of the state, much less most of the country. So the reality is this was not simply a matter of what happens to young women. This was a matter of what happens to all women. And it is truly a politics-trumping science moment that is unconscionable.
Well, there seems to be, in addition to a war against legal abortion, there seems to be a war against contraception.
I mean, a war against women, one would argue.
The Plan B decision by the Obama administration. You got Rick Santorum, the Republican, one of the Republican presidential candidates, who says he's opposed to birth control, period.
Well, I got to say, at least they're being honest. I mean, there is something refreshing about the American public finally getting a bird's eye view, an honest statement of what those extreme forces really want to do. They have always had their eye on the full prize, and that full prize for them is to deny women the ability to make personal private medical decisions about their reproductive health and their reproductive choices. And that includes being able to choose the most appropriate method of contraception for themselves, and that includes being able to make decisions during their pregnancy, whether it's a wanted pregnancy where something goes terribly awry, or a wanted pregnancy where they can carry it to term. But they need to have that ability to be the ones to make the decisions in consultation with their families, in consultation with their doctors. We've always known that they wanted to reverse Roe versus Wade. They have made no bones about that most of the time. But this really shows their true colors, and the fact that the GOP nominees seem to be trying to out-anti-choice each other, I think is a real wake-up call, and I hope it's a real wake-up call to the American public to understand what's truly at stake.
You know, as you said, the Republicans, I mean, it's part of their platform that they want to overturn Roe v. Wade. But do you think that, and of course all the Republican candidates say it should go, and the power should go back to the states to control abortion, access to abortion. But do you think that even a more conservative Supreme Court would reverse Roe v. Wade, given that American women and men have had more than 30 years of getting used to having access to abortions?
You know, I think your question is an incredibly cogent one and an incredibly appropriate one for this moment in time. That's exactly the question that Sandra Day O'Connor grappled with in 1992 when she wrote the opinion for the Supreme Court at a time I was involved in this case. It was a case out of Pennsylvania, speaking of Santorum, Planned Parenthood versus Casey. And at the time, we truly did the vote counts, and we thought we were 5-4 against us, and that we were going to see Roe versus Wade overturned. And for people who remember 1992, remember some other things happened. We then elected a pro-choice president, and soon thereafter. But one of the things that we look at now is we have a divided court on this. I am hopeful that they would, as you say, recognize, as Sandra Day O'Connor did, after many years on the bench of questioning Roe and wondering about Roe, she nonetheless came back and she said explicitly, at the time, an entire generation, I would argue now many generations, of women have come of age in the United States recognizing that they have available to them the right to choose abortion should contraception fail them. And that in fact, more than that, as she said, and I find this so powerful given that we just had an anniversary of Roe this past weekend, that she recognized that the ability of women to participate equally in the economic, social, and political life of this nation has been facilitated by their ability to control their reproductive lives. Now, I think never a truer statement has been said, and I would hope that the court, if it were to have a case that would give it the opportunity to revisit Roe, would look to that precedent, would look to that sage advice of Sandra Day O'Connor and say, not on our watch.
How are we doing? There seem to be a lot of contraceptive choices these days. Are we doing okay in terms of?
Well, you know, it's actually pretty extraordinary. We have really seen that the direction of contraceptive research now is thinking about what's going to make it the most possible for every woman who wants to prevent pregnancy to use a contraceptive method. It's not now just about the health considerations. It's also about how do you take it, in what form, how often. I think that's an extraordinary move forward. That said, contraception is still expensive for many women. It's going to be some time before we see the changes in the federal law and in the requirement of no copay for contraceptive services to come to fruition. And so I think that we are not, again, we are not done there, but I think we've seen a lot of real progress there. And I think, in fact, that progress is part of why you're seeing that backlash. You see that forward motion on contraception, and you see personhood amendment in Mississippi that would ban a contraception. I think this is
that would ban contraception?
Well, it would have, because it defined life as beginning at conception, which meant that every method of hormonal birth control on the market could conceivably be considered an abortifacient. That's their brass ring. They want it all.
Right.
We can't forget that.
You've got about less than a minute left, in which you're going to tell us what your immediate goals are for this year.
Absolutely. Our immediate goals here in New York are to pass the Reproductive Health Act so that women in New York can get the medical care that they need, and make sure that we take that out of the criminal statute and ensure that there's a health exception for the post-24-week circumstances. We're also going to look to the elections. We need a pro-choice majority in both houses in both chambers. We don't have that right now. We're going to be looking very hard at which seats we can flip. And we need, and last but not least, by any means, we need voters to pay attention. We need them to turn out and vote pro-choice in November.
Okay. I want to thank Andrea Miller, president of NARAL Pro Choice New York and the National Institute for Reproductive Health, for joining us today. For more information on the organizations, go to their websites, prochoicenewyork.org and nirhealth.org. For the City University of New York and 1 to 1, I'm Sheryl McCarthy.